So what we've tried to do in our coverage of American civilization and culture after the Civil War is trace the ideas that inform the American public as to how they are to live. We're trying to figure out in many ways what the public philosophy was that determined how Americans viewed themselves, viewed the country, viewed its aspirations, etc. And one of the arguments that I'm making here in this class is that when you go from romanticism to pragmatism, then pragmatism to progressivism, and progressivism to imperialism, so all of these isms that shape our public philosophy prior to the 20th century, you then end up with two possibilities in the 20th century that will determine American life. On the one hand, it's the outgrowth of what we called individualism that dominated most of the 20s that we called roaring. Well, what is individualism? Individualism is the idea that if I try hard enough as an individual, if I work hard enough, if I make the right choices, if I pull myself up by my bootstraps and I do so with others and I form associations, I'm going to be able to live a prosperous life. I'm going to be able to provide that prosperous life for my family, for those who are close to me, if I start a business, for those who work for me. So that's one dynamic of American life, individualism, that is very much tied with this idea of you let an individual unto himself and he'll create a prosperous existence for himself and for others. And this is a very different way of looking at life than the isms that dominate much of European life in the 20th century. Whether it's Marxism or relativism, there are kind of pessimistic philosophies about life that suggest that human nature left unto itself will create anarchy or mobocracy or injustice. But in America, that's not the idea. In America, the idea is that leave individuals unto themselves and life will work well. Well, what happens at the end of the 1920s when we have a depression, a stock market crash, and the whole system is thrown up into the air? Do Americans retain their sense of pride about individualism, or do they turn to a new way of thinking about themselves and their country? Do they turn back, I might add, to progressivism as a notion as to how we ought to organize ourselves? So what is progressivism? Progressivism is the idea that there are injustices that the system produces because of inequality. That, yeah, you can allow individuals to make their own choices, but what happens if one individual has this much in life and another individual has this, much less? What happens if one individual is born into very favorable circumstances and another individual is not? What happens if one individual is given a great gift of oratory or the ability to figure out business, but another individual is not? The system of individualism, the progressive argues, allows for radical differences, and those radical differences produce injustice. And it's just this injustice that we see in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck's novel is the defining novel of the 1930s. It's the defining novel of the Great Depression. And in it, what Steinbeck wants to argue is that there's something wrong with how Americans conceive of themselves, of life, and of justice. So let me return you to this four-part metaphysic that I've employed oftentimes in our coverage of this course. The top of the metaphysic is God. God rules over all that is. Then you have nature, God's creation, and then you have human nature, that special part of creation that is like God in that it too can create something. And what we create is artifice. What we create is the societal institutions that are around us. So God, nature, human nature, and human art. What Steinbeck tells us in The Grapes of Wrath is that we cannot count on God to save us. We cannot count on Jesus to save us. We cannot count on a Christian notion of redemption to save us when we're going through a Great Depression. In fact, we must turn to the hardness of nature. Right? Here you think about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and you see within the Dust Bowl that God's moral agency is not at play in our existence. What's at play is who we are as human beings and how we treat one another. So when you read these first four chapters of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, note what Steinbeck tells us about human nature and note what he tells us about the institutions we've created. So here I want to turn your attention quickly to the beginning of the work. And I want you to work with me through the cadence of these first few lines of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Chapter 1, now this is on page 1 of the novel. To the red country and part of the gray country of Oklahoma, the last rains came gently, and they did not cut the scarred earth. The plows crossed and recrossed the rivulet marks. The last rains lifted the corn quickly and scattered wheat colonies and grass along the sides of the roads, so that the gray country and the dark red country began to disappear under a green cover. Here, what Steinbeck is doing, he's beginning his novel and giving us a Genesis-like account of what life, what nature was like in the 1930s. But as you move forward in this chapter, in his description of nature, what do you see happens? All of the bounty and the beauty of nature and of harvest seem to wither away. And all we're left with are trucks and laws and rules and all the rest that Steinbeck argues at the beginning of his novel hold men down. Individuals, he's going to tell us here, living within this more difficult nature have been taught to become greedy, to get as much as they can, rather than do the right thing to their fellow neighbor. So what's going to happen as we move forward through the Grapes of Wrath is Steinbeck's going to suggest we don't have to abide by those old rules that condition us to be greedy. We ought to be altruistic beings who change our institutions, change our artifice, try something different so that we can create a political universe, a moral universe that is just for everyone involved.